there was all kinds of discourse, as you might imagine, that emerged. I'm not talking about from random people online. I'm talking about from people with a prominent platform. And some of it was basically justifying what happened to Charlie Kirk, saying that he's a hate monger, he advocates wars, including defending the Israeli war in Gaza, he has denounced trans people, and so he's full of hate, said this theory, and therefore got what he deserved, like it was some kind of karmic justice, or just that we should celebrate when people who have political differences with us die, or are murdered, or are killed. There's an MSNBC segment, I believe we have this, which is quite remarkable because it's Matthew Dowd, who is a former, I don't think we have that MSNBC segment. Oh, we do have it actually. It's with Matthew Dowd, who spent a lot of time at ABC News, and I want you to listen to what he said. This was before it was known that Charlie had died, but when it was known that he was shot, and obviously an extremely serious and grave event. And this is what Matthew Dowd went on MSNBC to say.
But following up what was just said, he's been one of the most divisive, especially divisive younger figures in this, who is constantly sort of pushing this sort of hate speech or sort of aimed at certain groups. And I always go back to hateful thoughts lead to hateful words, which then lead to hateful actions. And I think that's the environment we're in, that people just, you can't stop with these sort of awful thoughts you have and then saying these awful words and not expect awful actions to take place.
So that was essentially not just justifying the shooting, but blaming Charlie Kirk for his own shooting, essentially saying that he spreads hate, and hatred, when you spread it like Charlie Kirk did, leads to hatred coming back or to a hateful environment with violence and the like. And he said that without having any idea who the shooter was, what motivated the shooter, what ideology he had, what cause he had, whether he had a cause. And I find that just so despicable. Like, it really takes a dark soul to react that way. And this is what I want to address. So there's a lot of other claims like that circulating, a lot of them focused on the fact that Charlie Kirk defended the Israeli assault on Gaza. He's also had some moments where he's diverged from the strong pro-Israel position, including questioning why the United States has to pay for that and the like. But overall, he was a defender of Israel, including its war in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu just moments ago posted a tweet lamenting his death and saying what a great friend he was to Israel, how he talked to him about coming to Israel in a couple of weeks. And so there are a lot of people saying, look, he basically endorses a genocide every day in Gaza. There are innocent people being shot in the head and the neck. There's lots of reports about IDF soldiers sniping kids in the head and the neck. Lots of reports from Western doctors about this practice. People being blown up and starved to death. We know the whole litany, and because he supports that, and that's something so terrible that we shouldn't mourn his death, or at the very least, we should be indifferent to it. Kind of setting up a standard that human life isn't really sacred, that if somebody has political opinions that are different than yours, then you should not only refuse to mourn their death, but even in some way celebrate it. And I understand this temptation. I understand the temptation to do that. And by the way, you see this on the right a lot. If some very, very outspoken critic of Israel were murdered, they would dig through their statements and saying, oh, look, they supported October 7th, or they supported Hamas. They supported the killing and rape of innocent people, and therefore I think this person doesn't really have any value. You can do that. It comes from every faction. And you can, pretty much do that about everything. And I think I just want to make a couple points before I get into the specifics. So I was actually talking to a friend just a few days ago about the Catholic Church and how I admire its consistency when it comes to what it insists is the sanctity of all human life. There's a lot of people who affirm that they believe in the sanctity of human life, But the Catholic Church's positions on the question of human life are extremely consistent with that premise. They, of course, believe that abortion is murder and sinful because it's the extermination of human life. And they also believe that legalized euthanasia is a sin because that is the deliberate extinguishing of human life. And that's something that should be regarded as so sacred that we shouldn't have the right as human beings to just deliberately extinguish human life. And then they also are vehement opponents of the death penalty in all cases. Doesn't matter how grave of a crime you commit, how atrocious of a crime you commit. The Catholic Church's position is that the death penalty is wrong for the same reason that the sanctity of life has to always be upheld and that human beings should be barred. Obviously, they recognize in self-defense and the like, but should be barred, that we should insist on a framework that honors the sanctity of all human life. And you don't have to agree with them on any of those positions. You can disagree on their position on abortion or the death penalty or euthanasia. But I think overall, and of course the Catholic Church is a very flawed institution like any human institutions. It hasn't always comported with that view, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it is extremely valuable to do as much as possible to affirm the sanctity of all human life, that we don't celebrate when other human beings die. I think it creates a very dangerous framework for everybody, because if Charlie Kirk can be murdered for his political views because they advocate death, then anybody could as well. I mean, most people think the Iraq War was a hideous war crime, the invasion of Iraq, and I should remind you that 70% at least of Americans supported that. Essentially every political leader of both political parties supported the war in Iraq. So you could easily make the argument that they were responsible and have blood on their hands for thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even 1 million people. And not just political leaders, but like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and John Kerry, but also George Bush and John McCain and Mitch McConnell. It goes on and on and on. But also huge numbers of journalists. Charlie Kirk wasn't part of the government. He wasn't setting policy. So I think that it's a very dangerous game to start playing when you start justifying the murder of people because of their political views. But, and I should say, you know, I saw a lot of people today comparing this to what Luigi Mangione did and the way a lot of people cheered that. To me, that's very different. Without commenting on whether it was justified or not, I'm just saying it was a completely different act. Luigi wasn't murdering somebody because of their political views. In his mind, he was murdering somebody, allegedly, because he was the head of a company that, in its actions, inflicts all kinds of psychological suffering and death on huge numbers of innocent people. So you can't say Charlie Kirk did that. Charlie Kirk isn't the head of an army. He's not the head of a country. But I also think, you know, getting back to this sanctity of life issue, I think one of the things that online discourse has done is it has drained so easily the humanity of other people. It's there on social media because basically what makes us human is stripped away. We're just names on a screen, or we're our tweets or our interviews or our political views that define who we are. And that is an important part, especially of someone like Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk was, in his public life and his work, a political figure, and his political views were an important part of his identity. But they weren't the only part of his identity. He had other extremely important parts to his identity. Beginning with the fact that he was a human being, that he was the husband to his wife, that he was the father of 2 young children. And I can surmise the kind of agony and pain his wife and their children have and are going to have for a long time to come. And I think it's important to take that into account when you're deciding how to look at somebody. Not just when they're murdered, but how to look at somebody in general. So Charlie Kirk just a couple of weeks ago was on Fox and Friends, and he went with his wife and their 2 young children, and here's some video of that. There you see his daughter running over to him. I don't know if we have sound. All right, let me start again.
Oh, beautiful.
All right, so this is the video that people put together of Charlie with his wife and children. So if you're somebody who's cheering it or justifying it because he has a different opinion than you on trans issues, or even something as obviously important to me as what I regard as the genocide in Gaza, and I do think advocating for that genocide or defending it is a mark against someone's character, to put it mildly. I still don't think that, especially, this is not Benjamin Netanyahu. This is not Ben Gvir or a soldier in the IDF or a general in the IDF, who are all valid targets. And I think it is important to maintain an extremely narrow range of when violence is justified, political violence is justified, not to expand that. It seems like it's just expanded beyond any recognition. Basically, like anytime anybody who has a different political view of yours than yours on an important issue, it means that we celebrate their death. And what you're also celebrating is the grief and the agony of those two little kids and his wife, and the loss of a human life at the age of 31. And someone at the age of 31 is so unformed, they're kind of heading into the prime or peak of their life. But let's remember that Tucker Carlson, when he was 31, was a completely, totally different person, politically at least, I'd say personally as well, than what he is now. And you don't know why somebody has certain views. I mean, there was a time in my life when I was a lot younger where I did actually hate people who held certain views on the issues I cared about most, where I really personally hated them. And then at some point I came to understand that all of us are the byproduct of our social and cultural influences. We're all the byproduct of propaganda and all kinds of ways that we see the world. And although I do think certain people in public life merit hatred, the number of people who do is pretty small. And I don't think that someone merits that simply because their political views are offensive or even supporting horrific things. Because again, if that is the standard, essentially everybody, I mean, who among us hasn't supported policies at one point in our life, or views or ideologies that cause the death of others? And that can justify the murder of basically everyone. I mean, that is just, all out with political violence, right? But I also think, aside from creating a very dangerous framework for society, I also think and this might even be more important, I think it's very corrosive to one's spirit and soul to celebrate the death of other human beings. I'll just tell you a quick story about that. When Osama bin Laden was killed by the US government in 2010, that night President Obama announced it. And I was in the US that day, but I got on a plane to return to Brazil before that announcement was made, and so I didn't know that it happened. And I arrived in Brazil and turned on my phone and saw that. And I also saw this news that people were marching in the street and celebrating like their football team had won a world championship. And Obama said, "This is what makes America great." What, the fact that you can go and murder like a person who's ailing and with his wives sitting in a home? I mean, I'm not saying it's unjustified at all. I think that's a separate question. I've talked about that before, why I think it's better to arrest somebody and put them on trial. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about this extreme celebration that took place, like marching in the street. Yeah, we're America, over the fact that multiple human beings were murdered, were killed. And I remember I got it that day. I left the airport and I got into a taxi. I don't want to be cliche about this, but I did start talking to the taxi driver. And he said to me, like, what? I understand wanting to kill Osama bin Laden, but like, what kind of people go around like partying in the street over someone's death? Even somebody like Osama bin Laden. And I wrote about it the next day. It really got me thinking a lot, like, why do we celebrate this, the extinguishing of human life, especially when it wasn't in self-defense? Again, separate from whether it was justifiable or not, I just think the more you celebrate the death of other people, the more you crave the violent extinguishing of human life, the more your spirit and soul corrodes. I just think it makes for a very crude and kind of primitive and harsh and brutal culture and society and internal life. I really try hard to avoid it in every instance. And again, I'm not immune to these temptations. I understand why people react this way. But to take a 31-year-old man who has never killed anybody, has never presided over a war, has never implemented violence, whose greatest crime, I guess you could say, is that he has advocated horrific wars, including the one in Gaza. I just can't find any remote justification for it. And I actually think it's quite despicable to go on the air like Matthew Dowd did on MSNBC and basically say, oh yeah, he deserves it. He was a hate monger. He had hateful views. I promise you, whatever your views are, whatever they are, you can think they're as benevolent and benign as you want. There's a lot of people who are in this world who think that your views are hateful and dangerous. And celebrating this or justifying this in any way, I think is reprehensible. But I also think it does a lot of damage to you as well. Now, I will say I knew Charlie. I didn't know him well, but I had some interactions with him. I was on his show, I think, a couple times. And I always found him to be very genuine. Like, there are views that he holds that I do with other people might find hateful, but I don't think that he ever was really motivated by malice toward anyone. I really don't. And it's easy to say, oh, he was kind to me, therefore he was probably kind to everybody, but go and try and find anybody who has a bad word to say about Charlie Kirk interpersonally. And that also has to matter. You know, there are people in politics who are just driven by pure hatred. And then there are people who have views that, again, are the byproduct of all sorts of things, but still try and treat everybody decently. And, you know, you could see his kids running over to him, and they clearly loved him as their father. And I think it's so corrosive to just take a tiny little sliver of someone's existence and identity, namely their political views, and then justify and applaud their death. And you can see huge numbers of people doing that all over the place. And I'm going to give you some examples in just a minute, but that's my view on that. Now, on the other side, and we have talked about this many times before, this really creepy desire to immediately exploit any sort of political violence before anything is even known about what happened. And I've talked about this, how the right does this and the left does this as well, every single time. There's like this scramble to say, oh, this person was on the left who did this, this person on the right who did this was a Muslim, this was a white supremacist. And like, I'm sorry, but the idea that political violence is monopolized by the left or the right is complete and utter bullshit. It is completely false. And there are so many people claiming that today, like there is when just a month ago, a Christian evangelical who was extremely pro-life went and murdered 2 Minnesota politicians, or murdered 1 Minnesota politician, a Democratic Speaker of the House, and also murdered her husband, and then shot another couple. And the FBI said he had a list of 45 politicians he wanted to kill, all Democrats. And a lot of liberals were saying, oh, look, this is the sort of thing that the American right produces. To say nothing of all the murders and massacres by people who do it explicitly in the cause of right-wing causes, like anti-immigration or Muslims coming into the West. And there's also plenty of violence from liberals and the left too. But one of the ways the American right has tried to immediately exploit this is basically by calling for genuine, severe crackdowns on basic political liberties in the United States. And I will give some license to some of these people because some of these people knew Charlie Kirk personally and are enraged and disgusted and emotional about watching a 31-year-old man just have his life extinguished in a heartbeat with a bullet to his neck while he's speaking on a college campus, something that we actually encourage people to do and want people to do. So I understand that, but if you're going to speak publicly on a certain issue, I think you have the responsibility to make sure that you have your emotions under control. So while I give a little bit of license, I don't think that's an excuse for some of these kinds of attempts to really gin up hatred and repression in the name of avenging him or having it prove a point about how the violence really comes from the, quote, radical left. Here's Christopher Rufo. The last time the radical left orchestrated a wave of violence and terror, J. Edgar Hoover shut it all down within a few years. It is time within the confines of the law to infiltrate, disrupt, arrest, and incarcerate all of those who are responsible for this chaos. J. Edgar Hoover instituted what became notoriously known as COINTELPRO, where the FBI infiltrated all sorts of political groups against the Vietnam War for civil rights. They persecuted all kinds of people who had political divergencies, but it's also been done to the American right as well. Do people like Christopher Rufo not remember that? The American right has been infiltrated by Homeland Security and by the FBI under the same theory. Oh, this is an insurrectionary movement. They're a threat to the democratic order, and therefore we need to shut them down. The whole January 6th commission was about taking away political liberties from the American right, basically trying to criminalize the Trump movement. I've seen that in Brazil here too, where the Bolsonaro movement is in the process of being criminalized and has been criminalized for a long time. So just like endorsing political violence with the belief that it's never going to come back to you and your allies, or endorsing censorship because it's someone whose views you hate and not realizing that that will come back and eventually be used against you, calling for political repression by the FBI after the conservative movement, the right wing, the MAGA movement spent years, the last 8 years, complaining about the politicization of the deep state and the interference of these deep state institutions in our domestic politics, now suddenly want to weaponize it to shut down. And you're going to see how broad what Christopher Rufo means when he says those responsible for this chaos. They don't just mean people who engage in violence. They mean what they think is the entire political ideological edifice that motivated this violence. Liberal NGOs, the Democratic Party, and on and on. Left-wing groups. And again, I mean, if you want to create that standard, I promise you, it's already been used against your movement, and it will continue to be used against your movement the next time there's a Democrat in charge of this machinery, and that will happen, and it'll happen relatively soon, I promise. Here's Laura Loomer, quote, "It's time for the Trump administration to shut down, defund, and prosecute every single leftist organization. If Charlie Kirk dies from his injuries, his life cannot be in vain. We must shut down these lunatic leftists. Once and for all, the left is a national security threat." Libs of TikTok, always sober and restrained, all capital letters, "This is war." Sean McGuire, the pro-Israel fanatic, and by the way, so far, every person who's been saying this, Chris Rufo, Laura Loomer, who did I just show before? Libs of TikTok, Sean McGuire, these are all pro-Israel fanatics. They hate the left because they're worried about the movement against Israel, and they want to. That's what they want to shut down. Here's Sean McGuire, the Silicon Valley whatever investor, who's made some extremely inflammatory statements that got him in trouble in Silicon Valley about Israel and Gaza. Even for Silicon Valley, he's gone too far. He said, "We're not supposed to say this, but the truth is we're at war. So we're in a civil war." Sean Davis, whose commentary I often appreciate, but also speaks sometimes from emotion, said this, quote, "The Democratic Party is a domestic terrorist organization." whose most fanatics will not hesitate to murder their political opponents. This was not a one-off event. A Bernie bro tried to murder an entire park full of Republican lawmakers. A deranged left-winger attempted a mass shooting at the Family Research Council building. They tried to assassinate Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett before the Dobbs decision. Their demonic trans foot soldiers murdered Christian children while they worshiped at church and studied at their desks. They tried to blow Trump's head off on live TV after failing to bankrupt him and have him thrown in prison for life. Their race warriors spent an entire summer burning cities to the ground. Antifa will ambush and kill cops without remorse. They'll watch one of their own plow a vehicle into a Christian parade and shrug and then tell you to calm down about it. CNN and MSNBC are deranged left-wing personalities on Blue Sky, deliberately incite violence, and when it happens, they take the psychopath's route of mocking and gaslighting the victims. Terrorist Democrats will not stop. Just look at their reactions right now. They either are laughing about it or lying about it. But deep down, they're fine with it. And until they are stopped, until every single nut job inciting this madness and cheering it on is held accountable and removed from civil society, it will not stop. How much longer can this madness be tolerated? Now, it is worth noting that pretty much every prominent Democrat, I gave you some examples before, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, on and on and on and on, came out and vehemently condemned this, talked about how dangerous and wrong it was. Many journalists and pundits associated with American liberalism or even the left has done the same. So pretending that this is some sort of pervasive view of Democrats or liberals, that they believe in violence, is just as irrational as if after the massacre of the 10 black people in Buffalo in a supermarket by somebody who believed in replacement theory and believed that non-whites were immigrating to the United States to replace white people, or other similar mass shootings like Anders Breivik in Norway, or the one in Christchurch in New Zealand, Dylan Roof entering a church in Charlotte and purposely killing, in Charleston and purposely killing black people. There's been a lot of right-wing violence as well, politically motivated right-wing violence. As I said just a few weeks ago, an evangelical Christian, a pro-life extremist, went and murdered 2 people, a Democratic politician and her husband, and then tried to murder 2 others. He shot 2 others and they both survived. Also Democratic politicians in Minnesota, with a long list of Democrats that he wanted to kill as well. There is definitely a lot of left-wing violence as well, and there are a lot of people justifying it today. There's no denying that. But no political faction has a monopoly on this. None. Remember all those abortion murders, the doctor murders that we witnessed? And they would try and blame Bill O'Reilly because he was pro-life and saying that that abortion is murder. And so they say, of course, Bill O'Reilly is going to incite people to go and kill abortion doctors like he's done. Or they tried to blame the Buffalo shooting on Tucker Carlson on the grounds that he advocated the great replacement theory, and so did the shooter. This is not rational or sober or constructive behavior, to put it mildly. The idea of exploiting Charlie Kirk's death and the emotions around it to call for an FBI crackdown and closing your political enemies, arresting Democratic Party leaders, putting all liberal NGOs in jail. Mike Cernovich, quote, the Rubicon has been crossed, not by Trump or MAGA, but by the far left. Randy Paul can shove his book reports up his ass. Fuck everyone who played footsies with these dark demonic forces. We will not be scolded any longer. And then the second tweet was General Franco referring to the Spanish fascist. And what he's referring to there when he says Randy Paul can shove his book up his ass, he's referring to the Constitution. Rand Paul just last week objected to the vaporizing of 11 lives with no evidence, no process, no congressional authorization in a small boat off the coast of Venezuela, by saying due process is important. It's foundational to the American way of life. And Mike Cernovich is saying, shove that book up your ass, meaning the Constitution. We don't care anymore. Here's Ron Coleman. I think every person here so far is a fanatical supporter of Israel except Mike Cernovich. Ron Coleman, quote, "We need to start talking about the things we never dared talk about. We're going to have to break some eggs." Matt Forney, quote, "Charlie Kirk being assassinated is the American Reichstag fire. It is time for a complete crackdown on the left. Every Democratic politician must be arrested and the party banned under RICO. Every libtard commentator must be shut down. Scholastic terrorism, they caused this." Now, obviously, this idea of scholastic terrorism was exactly what was used under the Biden administration to try and criminalize the MAGA movement, as well as the first Trump administration when they really weren't in control of many things. They did ban Trump from social media after January 6th. They banned huge numbers of MAGA supporters on the grounds that they were inciting violence and insurrection. And there was an effort, and I reported on it repeatedly, to try and characterize the MAGA movement as an insurrectionary criminalized movement in order to do exactly these sorts of things. And you can always say, oh, well, since they did it, we're going to do it to them. I hear that all the time with censorship. Yeah, we're on the right and we're censoring people, but they censored us. That's just fueling a framework you claim to oppose. And so many of these people have such disgusting inabilities to perceive themselves. For example, here's Dave Portnoy today, who rose up to condemn those who would celebrate Charlie Kirk's death. Dave Portnoy said, quote, "Absolutely disgusting and disturbing video from Charlie Kirk shooting today. Hoping for the best for him and his family. Anybody who is happy about this is a disgusting human." And as I said before, I largely agree with that sentiment. I wouldn't go so far as to say someone who's celebrating it is a disgusting human. I understand the instinct, the temptation. We're all susceptible to that. I think it's disgusting, though, to celebrate anything like this remotely in this realm. Except, here's a tweet about the same Dave Portnoy where he just said this just yesterday. Barstool Sports CEO Dave Portnoy says he hopes a missile hits Greta Thunberg's boat as she sails toward Gaza with aid. Quote, I hope they hit a fucking like a missile on her boat. Knock that boat down, Greta or whatever her name is. So he's calling for missiles to blow up people bringing aid to Gaza, bringing medicine and food to Gaza. Mostly to just illustrate the point that there's an Israeli blockade. He wants those people murdered. And he's giggly about it, but then at the same time he turns around and says anyone who is celebrating this death is a disgusting human being. I mean, if you're going to have principles, this is what I was saying about the Catholic Church and their insistence on honoring the sanctity of human life, you at least have to be consistent. Otherwise, you don't believe in anything you're saying. Here's Elon Musk today with his gigantic platform on X, the largest by far of anybody, who just said this, quote, he retweeted Sean McGuire, that pro-Israel fanatic, and then Elon said this, quote, the left is the party of murder. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric, this is like Rwanda. This is the kind of rhetoric that can absolutely incite civic violence, civil war, more and more of these kinds of political assassinations. Those massacres that I mentioned earlier were carried out in the name of views that Elon Musk vehemently believes in. The dangers of Muslim immigration to the West, the way it corrodes Western culture and Western values. The attempt to replace white people, talking about white genocide in South Africa. These are all views that motivated the mass murder of Norway and of New Zealand and of Buffalo and many, many others. So it's just very, very like just putting blinders on and ignoring all the murders and violence that happen in the name of your own political cause and pretending that it only happens from the other side. And trust me, the liberals do exactly that. The next time some MAGA person or conservative, like the one in Minnesota, goes and does something like kill political figures in the Democratic Party, they're going to say, oh, look, it's the American right, they're violent, while they ignore all the violence carried out in the name of their political views. The only solution to this is to condemn it as a principle, as an act. And not just for pragmatic reasons, but because I said, like, on principle, celebrating the death of other human beings, except in very narrow circumstances, which this doesn't remotely enter, no matter what your views of Charlie Kirk are, it just corrodes your humanity and the culture and the norms in which our society functions. Now, there were a lot of people celebrating Charlie Kirk's death, as I said, but there were also journalists, so-called journalists, really cable news personalities, who just said some disgusting things. We showed you Matthew Dowd blaming Charlie Kirk, saying he spread hateful views and therefore he got hatred back. Basically not just justifying his death, but blaming him for his death. Here was MSNBC's reaction almost immediately after the news broke that he was shot.
After one of the Doge employees was allegedly attacked in Washington, D.C., that's what Donald Trump used as justification to send in federal troops into Washington, D.C. to get things under control. The carjacking situation, he used that. And I know it's hard to predict the future, Mark, but you can imagine the administration using this as a justification for something.
I mean, first of all, every single time there's violence of this kind, liberals instantly exploit it to say we need more gun control legislation. And yes, it is true that Trump supporters throughout the day, as we just showed you, without even knowing anything about the suspect, did try and exploit it to call on crackdowns and political repression and the like. But it's like right after, minutes after hearing this news, to simply say, oh, what my concern is not that this father and husband and friend and son and human being was shot in the neck while he was talking, but to start looking for ways to demonize Trump. I think that's demented also. Here is Hassan Mafi, who cited the fact that Charlie Kirk had said, let's show Charlie Kirk's tweet. This is something Charlie Kirk tweeted. I'm not sure how recent this is, but it's about the war in Gaza. He said, what's that? This is in 2023, so a lot of people said a lot of things like this in the wake of October 7th, but he's been saying similar things since. The deaths of women and children in Gaza are the fault of Hamas, not Israel, just like the death in Japan during World War II were the fault of Japan, not America. When a government engages in unprovoked murderous aggression, they are to blame for everything that results. And this person, Hassan Mafi, and this got 129,000 likes and 18,000 retweets. As of the time we screenshotted this, it's obviously a lot more, said, by the way, according to Charlie Kirk's logic, his death is his own fault, not the shooter's. And again, I understand the emotions around people who support the Israeli genocide in Gaza. I share those emotions as much as anybody does. And I absolutely do think that Palestinians have the right of armed resistance against Israeli soldiers and Israeli government officials who are presiding over this genocide. But that's not Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is an activist and an influencer. And as I said before, if you're going to create a framework where people who support unjust wars are justifiably murdered, essentially everybody is going to be, at some point, vulnerable to that, is going to be a legitimate target. Here's a popular Israel critic on Twitter, Mamadou, who, and this was mega viral, who said this, quote, Charlie Kirk recently said to a Palestinian that there's no such thing as Palestinians. Well, now look, there's no longer such a thing called Charlie Kirk. That went mega viral. 133,000 likes as of the time that we grabbed that. And if you're going to be horrified by what's happening in Gaza, it should be because you are horrified by the eradication of human life. And while most of those people in Gaza were innocent people, some of them weren't. Some of them have themselves killed or repressed political rights. But we don't go around trying to analyze it that way. The idea is that extinguishing human life, especially so indiscriminately and recklessly, is despicable and morally wrong. And this is the Israeli argument for killing journalists. Oh, these journalists aren't journalists, they're propagandists, they spread hatred. That's exactly the Israeli argument. So if you're taking this position that, oh yeah, Charlie Kirk spread hatred and propaganda, how do you object on principle to what the Israelis are doing and saying whenever they kill activists or journalists or whomever they want to kill who are saying things that they dislike in Gaza? It's the same principle. And yes, I know everybody who's on one side or the other thinks that they're right about the principle and the other side is wrong. But once you endorse this principle, there's no limit on it. There's no limit on who will be subjected to it. Political violence will just grow and grow and grow based on the disseminated and ratified belief that political violence is justified. Here's Ahmed Hassan. He's a Houthi rebel who is very interesting. If you don't follow him on X, I really recommend that you do. He said this, quote, "Yes, I hate Charlie Kirk because he's a pro-Israeli influencer, but that doesn't mean I approve of what happened to him. What happened here is a crime. I hate that he justifies crime, so I can't justify a crime that happened to him." I don't know why that's so hard. I don't know why that's so hard. I mean, this is somebody very invested. This is a Yemeni Houthi rebel who's not just speaking, he's acting in defense of Palestinians. And so he's saying, yes, I understand. I also hate Charlie Kirk's defense of the Israelis. I might even hate Charlie Kirk. But my whole argument in life is that criminal extinguishing of human life is unjustified and despicable. And I cannot condemn that if I'm simultaneously justifying the murder of those who are on the other side of me on these debates. You can hate Charlie Kirk's advocacy of Israel. You can hate whatever you want about his views. But to go from that to, and therefore I endorse his murder, I think that is morally depraved. And I think that the person that, there's going to be a lot of people harmed the more that's endorsed. But I really think the person who is harmed the most is the person who ends up embracing this really dark and just vacant view of the world. In any event, condolences to Charlie Kirk's wife and to his children and to his friends. And as I said, I knew Charlie somewhat, but I know a lot of people who know him very well. And I understand the pain and agony of someone dying very young, way too young. And I don't think I would wish that. I'm not going to say on anyone, because there is evil in the world. There are people who are murdering and engaging in genocide and the like, but I wouldn't really wish that on almost anybody. And if I'm going to have a standard that says it's sometimes necessary or justified to engage in political violence, I'm going to have as narrow of a standard as I possibly can where that's justified. And Charlie Kirk is universes away from any kind of remote justification. I think those who are celebrating this should really look inside of themselves and ask what it says about them that they are. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.